As I mentioned, after widespread protests on the weekend, pandemic restrictions are gradually easing across Australia. But the situation in Canada is going from bad to worse, with the government invoking rarely used emergency powers to disperse vaccine mandate protesters, even freezing their bank accounts. The situation is volatile and divisive. There are some extremists involved in the protest, as there are in just about every protest. And the anger spilled over in Parliament when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made this smear against the Conservative opposition.
Conservative Party members can stand with people who wave swastikas. They can stand with people who wave the Confederate flag.
That triggered uproar, as you would imagine, and it got this response.
My great-grandfather flew over 30 missions over Nazi Germany. My great-great-uncle's body lies at the bottom of the English Channel. There are members of this Conservative caucus who are the descendants of victims of the Holocaust. For the Prime Minister to accuse any colleague in this House of standing with the swastika is shameful.
Absolutely typical horrible overreach there from Trudeau. Meanwhile, the director of Canada's Civil Liberties Association, Noah Mendelssohn-Aviv, has condemned the use of emergency powers against the protesters. I spoke to her in Toronto and asked if the emergency powers were anti-democratic.
I think that might be one way of describing it. We have an Emergencies Act. The Act itself was passed by a Democratic legislature. But what the Act allows the government to do is now create new laws, bypassing democracy under what they have called a national emergency, that they haven't presented any evidence that satisfies us that it is in fact a national emergency as required under the Emergencies Act.
Yeah, where does this stand with the people's right to protest, legitimate concerns about what the government's doing, and will this emergency order actually inflame the opposition to the government, inflame the protests?
Well, there's certainly a question about the strategic benefit, but more importantly, you're right. You know, we at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association take very seriously the need for people to stand up and be able to defend their rights using the important democratic tool of freedom of expression and the right to protest, peaceful assembly. It's not without limits, but we have seen all kinds of disruptive yet peaceful protests, whether it's these ones against vaccine mandates, others about Indigenous land rights or about the environment or about anti-racism and the need for anti-racism initiatives. And every person who feels like their rights have been violated needs to be able to do so. Sometimes they'll do so disruptively, and as long as it is peaceful and within certain kinds of limits, it's a very, very important way in which people who don't walk the halls of power are able to express their needs. And we're very concerned that the government is saying that this is a state of emergency and that they're going to be using those powers in a way that does not meet the requirements of the Act.
It's extraordinary to see Justin Trudeau and his government react in this way to this particular protest, and also the political rhetoric has been off the scale. The Prime Minister called his Conservative opponents, he accused them of standing with the swastika. Surely that is beyond the pale and really goes to the sort of anti-Semitic language that we too often hear.
Yeah, I don't imagine that the Prime Minister was trying to suggest that to make anti-Semitic comments, and I don't know. I wouldn't want to speak or speculate for what he had in mind, but we have heard that there have been some white supremacist symbols amongst some of the protesters that have been a huge concern for people in Ottawa, in particular in the neighbourhoods where there have been some unlawful incidents. I mean,
sorry to interrupt, Noah. Sorry to interrupt, but when you invoke the swastika, when you invoke the Holocaust, you're demeaning and diminishing the great human tragedy that was the Holocaust.
Yeah, I think there has been concern on the part of the residents of Ottawa, in particular those areas, that there have been white supremacist and other similar kinds of symbols amongst some of the protesters, but that doesn't mean that all of the protesters affiliate with those symbols or believe in those symbols. It doesn't mean if there has been some unlawful activity, including harassment and vandalism and threats and perhaps worse, which is terrible and difficult for the residents of Ottawa, and we feel for them. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that every person who comes to stand there on the sidewalk support the effort for, the content of this protest, Give Out Coffee, doesn't mean that all of those people support those symbols. And it's a complicated and a nuanced situation, but we need to both understand that protest is important for people, in particular marginalized people, to stand up for their rights. And we need to be very, very worried about governments using emergency powers to bypass democratic processes.
Indeed, these people are protesting about very legitimate concerns that are reflected in other liberal democracies around the world. In fact, it's very easy to suggest that their civil liberties are being infringed upon by some of the pandemic measures, especially vaccine mandates.
Yeah, I mean, there have been all sorts of discussions about the vaccines, about the vaccine mandates. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association isn't speaking about that at the moment. Our concern here is the measures that the government is taking, declaring an emergency in order to deal with the situation under an act that on its terms says you can only declare a national emergency in the case of a serious threat, a serious danger to the life or health or safety of an individual, and that the provinces cannot address it themselves, or a serious threat to the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or security of Canada.
Noah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.